Ba 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 ba. Ba 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 ba. Ba 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 ba. Hi guys, welcome today to Fabric Modification. Today we'll be doing part one of a two-part series where we'll be covering pleating, gathering, and ruching. And then in a subsequent video, we'll cover hand embroidery and smocking. All right, guys, so make sure that you have all of your necessary supplies prepared, or pause me right now and make sure that you can gather them. But you'll be gathering your 3 pieces of base fabric, your strips of fabric for all of your fabric modifications, a ruler or measuring tape, marking pencil, pins, snips or scissors, thread and needle, and a nice surface to get everything organized onto. So for those of you who don't have an iron at home, but do have access to a hair straightener, I would recommend pre-tearing your pieces. One thing we'll talk about later on is that the place that bias would hold or straight of grain. So for these samples, I did use all straight of grain just to make it a lot easier to kind of do my prep. So taking your piece of fabric, you can start it like a lock of hair and holding it evenly on that top edge is just run it right down all the way along and making sure that you've gotten both sides of it, and then you can flip your piece and make sure that you've gotten the other end as well. All right, and provided that you haven't really picked large bulky fabrics, this should give you enough of a press just to get your samples going. All right, so now that you all prepped the supplies, we're going to move right into pleating. So a pleat is defined by fabric that has been made by folding back double onto itself and then stitching the top in place. For pleat math, you take your original length and you add the amount needed for each pleat, which is double the depth that each pleat takes up. So for example, see how there's the front and back of each pleat? So this side here are examples of 1/2 inch pleats that have been placed a 1/2 inch apart, as opposed to 1/2 inch pleats that have been laid side by side by side. So if you look on that edge, you can see how they all butt up against each other. Whereas on this side, which is the sample that I'll be asking you guys to do, is each pleat is laid its own pleat width apart from the other. So for a pleat, you have the top side, and then you have the under. And so in this case, since there's a 1/2 inch return and a 1/2 inch on the opposite side, these pleats need 1 inch of extra fabric for every pleat added. So if our base fabric here is 10 inches, we're going to go just below the writing, so 10 inches long, and we need an extra inch for every pleat. In this case, since the pleats are spaced a pleat width apart, we need to double the pleat length. If they were together side by side by side, like that other side of the sample, we would need triple the amount of pleat length because every spot on that waistband or what have you would be taken up with a pleat. All right, so now that we're all prepped, I'll show you how to mark your fabric either with a marking pencil or with pins to make sure that you can keep your pleats nice and even while you're working. Now, I've made inch markings all the way down my fabric piece, and just to show you guys the anatomy of a pleat, I'm just going to pin through where this marking hits that stitch line, and the same on this side right here. I'm going to smoosh those together. You see how now when I open that up, I have the same front and back of the pleat, but depending on which direction I point that, you can have a lot of variety with how you utilize your pleats. But for now, I'm just going to pin one side inwards. So then that way, this folded edge is a 1/2 inch away from that next marking. And now I'm going to keep working down that line. So taking the next pair of markings, I'm going to pin through where they intersect on that stitch line, get my layers nice and tight together. Once I get that first pin in, I'll fold to our right, and I'm going to pin the underside. So especially once you're sewing on a machine, you don't want to have this little piece flap back on you while you're stitching. So I'm just going to keep on pinning down this line, getting each of these pairs of pleats 1 inch becomes a 1/2 inch finished. And now I imagine we're going to speed up the video so that you're not watching me pin fabric. Alright, now that it's all pinned, we'll start by backstitching. Check out the tutorial linked in your handout if you need a reminder on how to do the backstitch. And that's regular pleating. Now we're going to cover box pleats and inverted box pleats, because where you have one, you'll have the other. So the math stays the same. Each pleat is double the width of fabric needed for the width of the actual pleat. The difference being for a box pleat, those folds of the pleat will face away from you or from the center. And then for the inverted box pleat, you guessed it, they'll face towards each other. And now for the box pleating and inverted box pleating, I'll show you how to mark your fabrics. Now these box pleats or inverted box pleats are still 1/2 inch returns on either side. And so you can see from the inside that it's 2 pleats that meet up to each other that still have a 1/2 inch return, which means a total of 1 inch on either side. So for every box pleat or inverted box pleat, you need quadruple the amount of fabric for each pleat. So in this case, if it's a 1/2 inch of return on either side, so it's an inch pleat on either side, it's 2 inches total for every box pleat of a 1/2 inch width that you need. So I've marked this fabric piece right here, just so I have a center, then the centers of those centers, so I can keep my pleats organized. But in this case, if I need 2 inches for a box pleat and 2 inches for an inverted box pleat, then I'll need a total of 4 extra inches on this swatch. So if my fabric is 10 inches, then this piece is 14. So now if we look at the fronts and backs of our sample, right now we have our box pleat here and our inverted box pleat here. And you can tell from the fabric that it's the right side because of the back stitching at the very, very top. But if we flip those over to look at the wrong sides of the fabric, our swatches will switch, our samples will switch. I'll have a inverted box pleat now on this side and our samples will switch. And we'll have our regular box pleat here on the wrong side and our inverted box pleat here. So now, if we have a regular box pleat that is going to be 2 inches total, I have 2 inches marked on either side of a center point here and the same on this side. So I'm going to keep the wrong sides of the fabric with the wrong sides of the fabric. So if I replicate these, then I'll make my appropriate pleats. So there's a few different ways to go about doing this. One of them is to take that marked fold and line it up to the center, just like that. And then pin that edge. And then pin the outside edge. So in that way you're getting pretty close to the edge of the fold. And then the same idea here, I'm going to fold right on that marked line. I'll bring it to the center and I'll make sure that my stitching line is nice and straight all the way. You can steal that pin that was marking the center. And then I'll pin really close to the edge So then that way, from the wrong side, what looks like an inverted box pleat is actually a regular box pleat from the right side. Is if I'm making my inverted box pleat, then what I'll do is from this wrong side, I will pin all of my box pleat together rather than doing it in the halves that I just showed. So I'm going to pin from the 1-inch mark on one side to the 1-inch mark on the other side, and then pivot downwards so that way the top of my pin is coming out the top. And then I'll stretch my fabric and lay it flat, get inside, and smoosh my pleat so that my pins line up. And then I'll pin one side of the dart and the other side of the dart, so that what looks like an inverted box pleat on the inside, what looks like a box pleat on the outside, is actually the inverted box pleat on the inside. And then that way, when I turn my right sides across, I have my sample here to match my sample that I've shown you guys already. Now that your samples are both pinned, we'll backstitch them about a 1/2 inch or 5/8 away from the edge. And that's how you can do box pleating and inverted box pleating. And we're finished the first part of this tutorial. Gathering is defined as drawing fullness into a smaller area. This fullness is meant to be visible, unlike easing, which is meant to be pretty subtle. We're going to use basting to draw that fullness down. Now, basting is one of those cool techniques that once you know how to use it, and to use it a bit more permanently, the same technique can be used in multiple different ways to achieve different fabric manipulations. So today we're going to play with different ratios of fullness and the different stitch placement to achieve different types of gathering. For your samples today, I'll want you to play with different ratios to show different fullnesses. So for example, on our center-based sample here, number 1, I have it as a 1.5 to 1 ratio. So for the 10 inches of sample, I have 15 inches of trim ready for that one. For sample number 2, our edge stitched gather, this one I have as a 2 to 1 ratio. So there's 20 inches of fabric for the trim as opposed to the 10 inches of sample. And then for sample number 3, the asymmetrical trim, I have it as a 3 to 1 ratio. So you guessed it, 30 inches of trim for this one here as well. Today we'll be doing hand-based just once down the center of each one or in its placement, but just know that usually for trim like this, for long yardage, we would usually use a machine-based or a ruffling foot to achieve long lengths of this. For sample 1, we'll do a center-based on this one, leaving the ends kind of ruffly. Now this is really good for trims that add fullness and a little bit of visual noise onto a costume. Before I start stitching my trim piece, I'm just going to mark the center of it, so then that way I can mark the center and mark the center on my base piece and be able to match them up later on. It's always easier to match your lines if you give yourself something ahead of time. So I'm folding it in half and I'm just giving myself a little finger crease, so that way when I fold it open, I'll have a line that I can mark on. I'm just going to put my pin on that line. Often I try to avoid using marking with pencils. It's a little bit easier for me just to pull that out later on. And that's the end of the center gather. So now we're going to try an edge gather or an edge ruffle. Oftentimes these are used on skirts, on hems, things to give a little bit more fullness to the edge of something. Now that I have it all basted, I'll do the same thing where I find my center point and I can finger press it to give myself a fold to work. And then I can pin. And then I can pin it onto my base fabric. Now know, depending on how you want your ruffle to go, if you'd like an exposed top edge, then you would pin it so that the right side was facing upwards, and you would still match your points. And then you would top stitch a stay stitch on that basting line. But if you wanted your ruffle to have a clean top edge like this, then you would place it right side to right side instead of wrong side to right side. And you would pin and gather your work this way, matching your ends. And then when you stitch here, then your gather would have a clean top edge and you would press that down. I tried it. It sucks to do by hand. So for the sake of this sample, I'm just going to have you guys make sure that you have a nice exposed raw top. And that's how you finish your ruffle or your edge gather. So our last sample is going to be an asymmetric basting stitch. This one kind of allows you just to play along the sample and to see what happens, but it'll be important to maintain that steadiness of stitch. Now for my third sample, for the asymmetrical ruffle, I wanted to show what would happen in case you don't have enough fabric to make one long 30-inch strip. And so in this case, I have two 15-inch long strips of almost equal width. Ideally, when they overlap, they shouldn't have that little jag on the bottom. But I'm just going to pin them so that way when I go to stitch them, they'll act as one piece. And now that you've finished your asymmetrical baste, that concludes the gathering section of this tutorial. And now our last sample, it will be the ruching sample, R-U-C-H-I-N-G, often mispronounced ruching, don't know why, but it's a thing. So ruching is defined as being gathered evenly on both sides, which, unlike gathering, which is gathered on one side, or unlike shearing, which is rows of gathering, ruching is just one on either side of that piece of fabric. You should write that down. It's okay, I'll wait. For our first sample, we'll leave those edges raw. So as talked about in the other two samples, it'll be important to weigh the differences of bias versus straight of grain for these as well. So for this one, leaving a little bit of a raw edge might be nice, but looking at the aesthetic of your garment or at your fabric, making the choice as to what type of fabric you'll use. These samples are done on straight of grain because they won't shred too much, and we'll talk a little bit differently once we get into sample 2, but making sure you're mindful of what type of fabric you're doing. For this one, you're okay to use straight of grain. It's okay. So for ruching, we'll have two different samples, one that's raw edged and one that's a folded edge. So for these as well, we're not going to worry about using bias because getting this kind of curve is doable because you'll be pulling each side separately rather than using the stretch of the fabric to create curves for you. And so I have two pieces prepped, one which is a 2-to-1 ratio, so 20 inches long, and I'll be using that for my raw edge sample, and one that is 30 inches long for a 3-to-1 ratio, and that one I'll be using for my folded edge sample. So now I've marked the center of this piece so that way I could center it on my base fabric later on, and I have 2 needles ready with long pieces of thread. So then that way I can be basting both edges, not simultaneously, but in a sense. Now that you've evenly basted down both sides, you're ready to pin it to your base fabric. So make sure that you pin your ends and your centers first, and then you can start finagling the fullness along the ruching. And that's how you finish your first sample of ruching. So to move on to the second sample, we discussed earlier a little bit about bias or not bias. For this sample, you'll want to use straight of grain. It'll make it a lot easier to press under the edge and to keep it all organized while stitching. Occasionally, bias gets a little bit wobbly when you're trying to press it evenly underneath. Now for our sample that has the edges that are folded under, I cut this piece at 2 inches to make sure that I had enough to fold under the edges. And now with an iron, you can go ahead and just press about a 1/2 inch under on either side. Now if you don't have an iron, you can use your hair straightener. I'm going to start just by finger pressing a 1/2 inch down because I find that easier to see. We'll be basting evenly along both ends again, stitching through all layers of the folded edge. Make sure to keep your stitches even and uniform while you're working. There's no need to mark centers on this sample because we're not actually trying to fit it down to a specific length, we're just trying to create shapes. Okay, so now that you've basted your edges together, you're ready to pin it onto your fabric. So start with one end and then just start playing with the rest to see what you can do. And now you're done with both of your ruching samples. And that concludes the end of our part 1 of fabric modification. So in class this week, we'll look at these techniques again and answer any questions you might have. But stay tuned for the next video and we'll dive into embroidery and smocking.